Today, my guest is author Elyssa East, and we will be talking to her about her new nonfiction book from Free Press, a division of Simon & Schuster, Dogtown, Death and Enchantment in a New England Ghost Town. Elyssa received her BA in Art History from Reed College and her MFA in Creative Writing from Columbia University School of the Arts, where she was the recipient of 3 prestigious fellowships. She was previously a nonfiction review editor at Publishers Weekly. I'm going to mention the fact that Dogtown won the PEN New England LL Winship Award in nonfiction at the JFK Presidential Library will be the presentation. And East lives in New York City. And that's where we're talking to her at. Elyssa, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, your book, Dogtown, is a strange and fascinating tale, and I'd like you to give my audience a brief overview of the story.
Sure. Well, Dogtown is really the biography of a landscape, and it weaves together the story of a murder that happened in this abandoned colonial settlement and the history of the place itself.
Well, and it's filled with details because I am reading the book, and to say it's strange and fascinating is an understatement. But tell my audience what drew you to Dogtown in the first place.
I was attracted to Dogtown originally because of the paintings by an American modernist painter named Marsden Hartley. Hartley was a contemporary of Georgia O'Keeffe and Edward Hopper, and he actually claimed that Dogtown changed his life. And I thought that was such a strange, compelling story. And the more that I started looking into this place, the more that I realized that, well, Dogtown itself is strange. It was once believed to be home to witches, pirates, and people went there escaping Indians and also pirate attacks. It has other occurrences of supernatural sightings there. And I just found this, deeply intriguing. But really, I first went there because of Hartley and his paintings, which were very unusual.
Give us a geographical and physical picture of Dogtown. First of all, where is it located?
Dogtown is located on the island tip of the Cape Ann Peninsula on the north shore of Massachusetts. It's about 25 miles northeast of Boston. And
it's, what is it, about 3,000 acres?
That's right. It's about 3,000 acres, and the area fills the entire interior of the island. It's an unpopulated expanse. It's been unpopulated since it was abandoned in the 1840s. And it's kind of a wilderness area, but it's about, for any of your listeners who are familiar with New York Central Park, it's about 2.5 times size of Central Park.
Mm-hmm.
The island it's located on is approximately the same size as Manhattan.
And it is, as you said, a wilderness, and it's loaded with these huge boulders that look like they've just kind of tumbled out of the sky. The one question I want to ask you is since it is such a strange setting, how come no photos in the book? Was that a publishing decision, or how did that happen?
That was a publishing decision. I wasn't involved in that decision.
Mm-hmm.
But there are photos on a website that I made for the book, and that address is just dogtownthebook.com.
Dogtownthebook.com.
That's correct. And up on that website are pictures of some of those very boulders that you mentioned. A Pleistocene-era ice sheet once covered much of North America, and the large boulders were left there by this ice sheet, which is basically a continent-sized glacier. And in the 1930s, a man named Roger Babson carved many of these boulders with what he thought were words to live by. They say things such as help mother, get a job, use your head, and they add to the oddity of the place as if the landscape's trying to talk to you.
I wasn't aware of the website, so I'm anxious to go on that and take a look at that. I'd like to jump before we discuss anything else. I'd like to jump to a terrible crime that was committed in Dogtown and how it affected the population. Let's talk a little bit about that crime, because that was in a horrible situation.
Sure. So this is the main story that's in the book, and in 1984, a woman was murdered in Dogtown. It was an incident of what's known as stranger upon stranger violence, which is actually very rare. Most murders take place between people who know each other, but this was just a very entirely random, extremely cold-blooded act. And the victim's husband later found her body. It created an incredible shock in the community. This crime happened in Dogtown, and Dogtown is a place that for many people in Cape Ann was considered kind of sacred, but for others it was considered dangerous. And this crime became a turning point for people's feelings about the place. Some people thought that it was a signal that, yes, this place was dangerous, if not evil, and others took this as an opportunity to sort of reclaim what they saw as the goodness in the landscape. So an effort was launched, and Dogtown was essentially cleaned up. All the riffraff was booted out. But it was really a turning point, and when I went there, starting in the late 1990s, people still talked about this. They were still very affected by it, and this really taught me how much that, we say that we're numb to violence, but we're really not. It has a lasting effect on communities. Even with people who didn't even know the victim, still felt very haunted by this event.
Well, I also think that it's interesting for my listeners to know that over this 3,000 acres, there were very few homes there. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. There was a colonial settlement, a village that was created there in the 1700s. Basically, the colonists cleared the land of all the trees, and there was a community that existed there of somewhere between 40 and 60 families. And then this village was abandoned after the Revolutionary War. It was believed that the population that remained were Revolutionary War widows. Many of them kept dogs for protection, which is how the landscape earned its name, Dogtown. There was also a community of freed slaves living there. But some believe that the name Dogtown really referred to, a pejorative for the people living there. And when the last of these residents, who was a former slave, was taken to the poorhouse where he died in the 1840s, the place was completely abandoned. No one has lived there since, at least not officially. And if you go there today, you will find the stone ruins of this village.
Now, since what I'm not clear on is, was it a fear of that area that prevented it from being built up originally, or was there a state law involved that prevented it from being populated? Why was it never really built up?
Well, part of why it was never really built up is this is an island community. Most population on islands centers around the coast because the economy centers around the coast. But for a time, people did try to farm the land, but the farming didn't work out. The land wasn't good enough for farming. And when they were attempting to farm, they did go into Dogtown. But it's a very, very rocky place. At the same time, though, there was a very well-established fear of the wilderness, and this is certainly part of early American history. There are allusions to it throughout stories of our earliest times. So there was a fear. And then after the area was abandoned, it acquired a very haunted reputation. It became a ghost town, and most of us, feel something kind of spooky or eerie in ghost towns. One of the things that makes Dogtown so unusual is that there are very few ghost towns or abandoned places on the East Coast. And years later, once Dogtown became, the land was actually used as a watershed for the city's water supply. So by the end of the 20th century and today, there are laws that protect at least part of the land, the part of the land that is watershed.
That's interesting. So since the murder, it's really hasn't been built up. Like you say, it's been cleaned up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But now we have to take a little break. And this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I am talking to author Alyssa East about her new nonfiction book, Dogtown. So if you hold on, we'll be right back. Can you? What I want to talk about first is the fact that you've created an interesting way to tell the story by alternating chapters with the story of the crime and the sinister history of Dogtown. And it's a wonderful, smooth way of doing it. But I just wondered why you decided to take this approach.
Well, thank you for the compliments. And I took this approach because it seemed to me that one couldn't really understand the murder and its full impact without knowing the history of the landscape, that the history definitely informed people's understanding of that tragedy.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And it really is very strange because when I first picked up the book and I looked at the cover, I got chills. I got spooked just by looking at the cover. So just looking at that, I think, gives you that feeling. Let's talk about what kind of research that you did on this.
Well, I started with this painter, Marston Hartley, as I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Then I was in the city archives. I was reading title deeds. Of course, I read the trial transcript. I interviewed members of the victim's family. I interviewed people in the community. I even read ship's logs. And I researched all around the topic. It was very time-consuming, but it seemed the best way to pull together a full portrait of a place.
Now, did you find in the early years that there were some maritime people that lived in Dogtown itself, or was this just to get background on the surrounding area from people? And the closest city is what?
Well, Dogtown is between Gloucester and Rockport. Those are the two big communities there. They're not necessarily big. The closest city is Boston. One of the things that's unusual about it is how close it is to Boston, 25 miles away. Some maritime people did live in Dogtown. In fact, with one of the pirate stories that's told in the book, it's believed that a particular sea captain who was harassed by this one pirate did live on the edge of Dogtown.
Well, what kind of problems did you encounter in doing the research?
Well, I hit a lot of dead ends from time to time, and then I knew that I just had to keep digging. And, I was an outsider in this community. I'm originally from Georgia. I don't live on Cape Ann. It is an island community. A lot of people told me, like, I doubt that old timer will talk to you. But I actually didn't have a problem getting people to talk, and I think that's because people have such a profound feelings about this landscape.
I think the other thing that struck me also that you might mention is the ethnic population mix, and basically they kind of lived in the past, and do they still live within their own little groups, and how did that add to the mystery of Dogtown?
Sure. Well, Cape Ann has different communities. There's a Sicilian community, there's a Portuguese community, there's a Finnish community, there's a Swedish community, and then there are, the good old New England WASPs. And these communities tended to, cluster together as people of like groups do. And they're still there. Some of them are not as, the boundaries between some of them are no longer as defined, but the Sicilian population is still very distinct. The Portuguese population is still very distinct. This is a fact of history and of the present day there. But this is a small island, and to have these communities there and to have their presence, their identity so strong is certainly part of what makes the place unique and so rich.
And was it not the early Sicilians that had a lot of superstitions and that kind of added to the idea of the mystery of Dogtown?
Really, it was the Puritans who had the suspicions.
That was the first group then.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, they saw signs of God's work in everything, in the snowfall and a bird flying across the sky. The Sicilians also brought their own suspicions or spiritual beliefs that did become part of the community and to a certain degree part of the story.
Yeah, and aren't there even now, at the time that you were researching the book and doing it, people that kind of spent time in the woods that were practicing a sort of witchcraft, for want of a better word?
Well, the witchcraft question is very interesting. Certainly people have considered Dogtown to be the true home of the witches, more so than Salem, but the accounts of actual witchcraft practice there have varied, and part of that is because, we don't really know what a witch was. Was a witch just a pejorative for a folk healer, for a midwife,
mm-hmm.
or were people actually really, working spells?
Well, so the question is, does it still exist there?
I absolutely am convinced that there is some witchcraft, or what I would consider to be alternative spiritual practices that happen in Dogtown. I ran across some people in capes there once. It is very close to Salem. I know people have told me about what they consider, to be private Wiccan or pagan rituals that happen there. And there are other folks who go there who identify as earth spiritualists. Some people go there and talk about the ley lines or other spiritual factors there as well.
The early widows that were left during the colonial times, they ended up with a lot of widows because many of the Revolutionary War guys didn't come back, and they were believed to be witches also, weren't they?
They were, and there's a very peculiar occurrence that happened, which was this there was a ship that disappeared, and no one ever heard from or saw these men again or any trace of the ship, but this giant ball of light traveled from house to house of these widows, and everyone saw this. And I think that this certainly added to these women's particular reputation as being witches.
It seems to be in a lot of history that I've read from that period too, that these poor women, the widows, were always given that rap, that there was something about them that people didn't trust. But
that's true, and even an unmarried woman in colonial New England was referred to as a thornback. Which is really not a nice sounding word.
No, a thornback. That's quite odd. What has been the long-lasting effect on the surrounding communities to the crime? And by the way, I'm not sure if we did mention, so let's mention it again, when the actual crime occurred.
Sure. The crime took place in 1984, and the long-range ramifications of this was for a time people really did fear Dogtown. In fact, there was a big vigil to take back the woods, kind of in the theme of taking back the night, those rallies that happen in many places today. But mostly people wanted to, I would say, reclaim Dogtown from the darkness. And so people got involved in fixing the place up. And today it is actually, it's still a wilderness. It's a very confusing place. It's easy to get lost there, but it's a place where you can go and see you won't necessarily see anyone, but families go there, school groups go there. You know, I think it was a turning point that people realized that they had to do something to fix the place up.
The woman that was murdered, the woman and her husband actually lived in one of the wild areas of Dogtown. Well, the whole area is wild, but I mean, they didn't they live in a trailer or something? But they were both educated people. Talk a little bit about their backgrounds.
They sure the victim and her husband had they were both teachers. The husband's family is Finnish. His grandfather was Paul Manship, who's a very well-known American sculptor. The sculpture of the Prometheus figure at Rockefeller Center that people often see on the Today Show is something that he created. And they were just people who loved wilderness. It was certainly part of their I would say, their larger spiritual belief. And the victim's husband still actually lives in the same place. His family reforested part of the land. For him, it was home, and even though the worst tragedy imaginable happened to him there, I think he felt that he had to stand his ground. And
and beat the witch thing away and the superstition. I want to tell my listeners that are just coming in that I'm talking to Elyssa East about her book, Dogtown. Now, again, why do the 3,000 acres remain abandoned, and does it have any other future other than the wilderness? Is the state or the federal government preventing things, or is it, again, its history and its location?
Well, part of it, it's really the history. Some of the title deeds on this land go back to the 1700s, and the paper trail has been lost. So there are parcels of land there of unknown ownership. And there, even as recently as 20 years ago, the tax rolls were in the newspaper listing people who owed back taxes on the land. One of the names was a colonial era school teacher named Granny Day, and this is just a sign of how much of a bureaucratic nightmare it is to go in and identify these parcels of land, some of which are very small. But part of the land is owned by the city now, and it's protected under federal watershed protection laws. But a large part of it is in private hands or of unknown ownership. It's a difficult place to build on because it's basically solid rock underneath. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to be built on in the next 10, 20 years.
Well, what are you working on now? Are you starting a new project, or are you just basking in the glory of this very interesting book and your wonderful, wonderful award?
Oh, well, thank you. I am starting a new project. I'm very interested in writing again about landscape and place and how much our environment shapes us and how much it shapes our psyche and our conscience.
Well, that sounds like a great project, and I hope you'll come back and visit with me when that time comes. And I'm afraid we are out of time now, and I want to thank you so much for being with us, Alyssa. And this is a great book, and have a good time accepting your award in Boston.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We have to take another break now. It's the Jacqueline Bachar Show.